Welcome to this breakdown of the Beatles' groundbreaking 1965 album, Rubber Soul. This album remains a fan favorite to this day, and for good reason. Featuring an eclectic blend of folk, rock, soul, and some pretty experimental stuff for the time, it has something for everyone. It's an album that has truly stood the test of time, and one that deserves a closer look. So grab a drink and get comfy, and join me as we go through each and every song on the album from start to finish.
The opening track on Rubber Soul has always felt like one of those classic songs you can just kind of feel in your bones, you know? With its playful bluesy beat and some cheeky lyrics, it kicks off the album with a mix of humor and swagger that's pure Beatles. But if you look closer, though, the story behind the song reveals how John Lennon and Paul McCartney were experimenting and riffing off each other's ideas in ways that pushed their songwriting into fresh territory. The first draft they came up with was basically a whole different song entirely. McCartney initially brought an idea with lyrics about a golden ring, hoping it would work as the song's hook, but both Paul and John knew it wasn't going anywhere. The phrase felt like a dead end, a flat rhyme without a heartbeat. In Paul's own words, rings was a fatal choice, too predictable to give the song any real spark. So as they often did, the two decided to step back, grab a cigarette, and let the answer come to them. Luckily, inspiration struck when Paul ditched the golden ring idea in favor of a bluesier phrase, "Drive my car." This was a much edgier image with double meanings that fit perfectly into the sly, tongue-in-cheek spirit they were after. The phrase itself was a nod to old blues slang where "drive my car" hinted at romance and, more implicitly, desire. Suddenly, the song had direction, transforming into a quirky story about a woman telling a man to be her driver, both literally and figuratively.
Once the lyrics came together, the next step was figuring out the right musical approach. That's where George Harrison's influence came in. Harrison had been listening to Otis Redding's Respect, a soul classic with a bass-heavy groove. He pitched the idea of using a similar rhythm for Drive My Car, where the guitar and bass would double up, creating a tight chugging feel. This sound wasn't typical for the Beatles up to that point, but it was a perfect fit for the sassy, playful lyrics.
So Paul, as usual, took the lead in arranging the parts. He played bass and sang the lead, but he also layered in some piano. For his part, George handled the guitar riff, creating a bold sound that was almost like a playful call and response with Paul's bass. There's always been a bit of debate over who actually played the lead guitar on this track. Many believe it was George, but some think Paul may have taken over. Either way, the effect is powerful, driving, bluesy, and unapologetically cool. Drive My Car was recorded at Abbey Road Studios on October 13, 1965, in a session that stretched into the early morning hours. At that time, the Beatles were just starting to pull later hours in the studio, a habit that would soon become the norm. In only 4 takes, they locked down the rhythm track with Ringo Starr on drums, John Lennon on tambourine, and Paul on bass. After that, they overdubbed the piano, cowbell, and vocal harmonies, finishing it off with the beep-beep backing vocals that added a touch of fun to the whole thing.
Looking back, it's clear that Drive My Car marked a shift for the Beatles. They'd always been talented songwriters, but Rubber Soul showed they were ready to push past pop conventions, exploring new themes and sounds. The song is playful and upbeat, but it's also a bit cheeky, like it's giving a little wink to the listener that says, "Hey, we're having fun, but we're also taking you somewhere new." And it's an important song for George Harrison, too. His contribution was huge, taking inspiration from American soul and putting it into a British pop context in a way that just worked. The result was a song that felt both familiar and fresh, setting the tone for an album that would go down as one of the Beatles' best. This song is a reminder of why the Beatles were so much more than a pop band. They were artists who weren't afraid to try new things and bring their unique voices to every track they created. And it's tracks like this that still put a smile on your face all these many years later.
The Beatles' 1965 album, Rubber Soul, marked a shift for the band, embracing deeper lyrical themes and experimenting with new sounds. Nowhere is this more evident than in the track Norwegian Wood, This Bird Has Flown. On the surface, it's a simple folk rock tune, but dig deeper and you find a song of swinging London lust, groundbreaking musical fusion, and a lingering hint of arson. John Lennon, the song's primary writer, was blunt about the inspiration. "I was trying to write about an affair without letting me wife know I was writing about an affair." And this also wasn't the doe-eyed girl next door of early Beatles hits. The woman in Norwegian Wood is independent and worldly. As the song's co-writer Paul McCartney explained, That Norwegian wood was a cheeky reference to the cheap pine paneling popular with mod Londoners at the time, stating, "I came in," and he had this first stanza which was brilliant. "I once had a girl," or should I say, "she once had me." That was all he had, no title, no nothing. I said, "Oh yes, well, we're there." And it wrote itself. Once you've got the great idea, they do tend to write themselves, providing you know how to write songs. So I picked it up at the second verse. It's a story. It's him trying to pull a bird. It was about an affair. John told Playboy that he hadn't the faintest idea where the title came from, but I do. Peter Asher had his room done out in wood. A lot of people were decorating their places in wood. Norwegian wood. It was pine, really, cheap pine. But it's not as good a title. Cheap pine, baby. Norwegian wood wasn't just lyrically adventurous, it was sonically groundbreaking. George Harrison, recently smitten with Indian music, introduces a sitar. George had just got the sitar, and I said, "Could you play this piece?" Lennon recalled. And according to the Beatles' official website, this marked the first time a sitar appeared on a rock song. George's attempt at playing the new instrument was still rather rudimentary, but its exotic sound perfectly matched the song's atmosphere. Harrison's interest would blossom into a lifelong study of Indian music and philosophy, leaving its mark on the Beatles' sound for years to come.
And the inclusion of the sitar influenced many other artists, leading to many rock bands to begin adopting the new sound as well. The Rolling Stones' Paint It Black, for example, was released the following year and featured a very prominent and unforgettable sitar riff played by Brian Jones.
Upon examination, it's easy to see how the song echoed Bob Dylan's lyrical style, and Dylan noticed this as well. Dylan's response was to write Fourth Time Around, a song that appeared on his album Blonde on Blonde. It features a strikingly similar melody and theme. Lennon was initially annoyed by this. "I was very paranoid about that," he admitted. However, he later appreciated Dylan's playful jab, and the rivalry between the two spurred each other to greater creative heights as time went on. The song's ending is famously ambiguous. Lennon spends the night awkwardly at the woman's place after crawling off to sleep in the bath, only to wake alone. His solution? The lyrics tell us, "So I lit a fire, isn't it good?" Did he literally burn the woman's house down? Lennon was coy, but McCartney supported the arson theory. It's this twist of revenge, or perhaps just wry commentary, that adds a dark edge to the song. Norwegian Wood remains a captivating enigma. It's a snapshot of swinging London's free love ethos, a landmark in the fusion of Western pop and world music, and a tale with a deliciously ambiguous ending. Whether it's about a one-night stand, a sly dig at Dylan, or full-on arson, its blend of catchy melody and lyrical mystery helped usher in a new era of rock and roll songwriting. One of the lesser-discussed gems from Rubber Soul, You Won't See Me, captures a slice of Paul McCartney's life back in 1965 as he was navigating a strained relationship with actress Jane Asher. The song is subtle yet powerful, with layered lyrics and a melody that hints at the ups and downs of young love. Let's dig into what makes this track a standout on an album that, to this day, is a staple in any serious rock collection. McCartney wrote the song during a time when things were becoming complicated with Asher, and the strain comes through in the lyrics. Though they hadn't yet broken up, Paul taps into feelings of isolation and frustration here, putting his own spin on what's essentially a breakup song. Musically, he built the melody around a simple two-note guitar pattern, a descending E and B string progression that keeps the song light and approachable even as the lyrics get a bit heavier. Paul himself has talked about how he just kept letting the note on the B string descend by a semitone while the top E note stayed put. He later added a descending chromatic bass line, giving the tune that classic Beatles harmonizing feel. It's simple but effective, a hallmark of Paul's songwriting approach during those days.
The song's lyrics touch on themes of emotional distance, frustration, longing, and helplessness. The repeated refrain, "If you won't see me," expresses both a plea and an ultimatum. The speaker seems stuck, unable to move on while still trying to reach a partner who won't engage. He's looking for some acknowledgement or a way to resolve their differences but feels turned away. There's a sense that the speaker feels powerless, with hands tied, trying to salvage the connection without any cooperation. This session was a late one for the Beatles. They started at 6 p.m. and worked through the night to complete the song in only 2 takes. One interesting detail is Paul overdubbing his bass line separately, trying to bring a Motown feel. Inspired by James Jamerson, the legendary bassist from Detroit, McCartney admired Jamerson's melodic, rhythmic style, which was a far cry from traditional rock bass lines of the time, And Ringo's drumming here is worth noting too. His parts were typically recorded with an Altec RS 124 compressor, a standard for Beatles' drum sound in those years. But here, there's a distinct tone to the drums that some speculate might come from a Fairchild 660, a compressor Jeff Emmerich would soon use on Revolver sessions. Whether or not it's true, the drums here do have a unique sound for the period. And Mal Evans, the Beatles' longtime roadie, also joined in on Hammond organ for this track, providing a single A note that subtly adds depth. It's barely audible, coming in at 229 in the left channel if you're really listening for it, but it's there.
Both the mono and stereo mixes were finished a few days after recording, done back-to-back on November 15th. There was no time to overthink it. They had a deadline to hit, and they managed to keep the song sounding fresh despite the crunch. There's a lot to appreciate about You Won't See Me. It's a simple tune at heart, yet filled with enough details to keep fans coming back. From Paul's unique bass line, inspired by Detroit's finest, to the subtle studio touches, it's a song that brings a lot of character to Rubber Soul. Back in 1965, John Lennon found himself in a tough spot. He'd spent hours trying to write a song for the Rubber Soul, but came up empty, feeling more isolated than inspired. Eventually, he threw in the towel and lay down, accepting that maybe nothing would come. Then, in a moment of resignation, he saw himself as a nowhere man sitting in a nowhere land. Suddenly, it all clicked and outpoured one of his most personal, introspective songs. Nowhere Man is Lennon's reflection on feeling directionless, his way of admitting that, even as a Beatle, he was struggling to find his own path. Paul McCartney has always called it one of John's best. Still, over the years, Paul's interpretations have evolved, sometimes describing the song as a look into John's own struggles, other times even suggesting it might have reflected his own life too. Musically, the recording of the song was pretty unique. George Harrison and Lennon attempted a harmonized guitar solo. They finally nailed it after a few takes, each playing a Fender Stratocaster with a high-pitched, ringing tone. The extra treble effect was so intense that the studio engineers initially resisted it, but McCartney pushed back, and eventually they got the crisp, piercing sound they were after. The track holds a special place for Beatles fans, especially since it was one of the few from Rubber Soul performed live during the band's final concert at Candlestick Park in 1966. That moment right before the Beatles stopped touring gives Nowhere Man an aura of both closure and nostalgia. The song also appears in the 1968 animated film Yellow Submarine, only adding to its lasting legacy. In the movie, the Beatles sing the tune to a creature named Jeremy, lost and lonely in the Sea of Nothing. It's a pretty funny little scene, and it hits on some of the same themes as the song: loneliness, and the sense that we're all drifting at times, hoping to find a solid connection. Lennon later described songwriting as something that came through him, almost like he was a vessel. Nowhere Man embodies that feeling. Somehow, he managed to capture what many of us feel when life's meaning seems to slip through our fingers. Decades later, thankfully, we can still pause at those moments when we're feeling stuck. Turn the music on and turn it up, and instantly remember that we're not alone, even when we feel like we're going nowhere. Think for Yourself is one of those songs that lands right in that sweet spot between the Beatles' raw beginnings and their more introspective, experimental phase. Written by George Harrison for Rubber Soul, it showcases his growing songwriting chops at a time when the band was eager to shed their image as pop heartthrobs and embrace deeper ideas. George himself said he wasn't quite sure who he was writing about. He vaguely pointed to probably the government years later. But that ambiguity has kept people guessing for decades about whether he was taking a shot at politics, personal relationships, or both. There's no question that the Beatles were evolving. They'd been spending time with Bob Dylan by then, who was one of their major influences. His wit and candor clearly encouraged them to tackle more substantial topics. For George, that meant thinking outside the classic boy meets girl formula. It almost feels like George was putting down a marker on independence and self-awareness, themes the Beatles would continue to revisit. Musically, the song is a bit of a departure from their usual fare. One standout feature is Paul McCartney's fuzzed-out bass, a sound that was fresh and gritty for the time. The fuzz effect came from a device called the Tone Bender, which had only recently been introduced. This was the first time the Beatles recorded bass with a fuzz box, giving the song a rougher, almost snarling edge. There's something about that fuzz bass that adds tension to George's lyrics, like he's deliberately making his stance bolder, more defiant. This sort of fierce-sounding tone helped to create the song's vibe of self-assured independence with a sound that commanded attention. Later, McCartney would use the same fuzz effect on Abbey Road's Mean Mr. Mustard, but this was where it all started.
The band was under a serious deadline to finish the album, yet there's still a lightheartedness that comes through. They even recorded a kind of goofy rehearsal tape that captured their studio banter, their humor, and some casual asides that never made it onto the Christmas fan club disc they were working on at the same time.
At the time of its release, the song's lyrics struck some critics as ambiguous. Is this about politics, love, or both? Was the common question. Lines like, I left you far behind, and the things that you do were just vague enough to allow listeners to interpret it their own way, whether as a kiss-off to a toxic relationship or a subtle jab at government hypocrisy. In a lot of ways, Think for Yourself is a kind of anti-love song, hinting at the distance and disillusionment with convention that was bubbling under the surface for the Beatles.
Over the years, this song has become more appreciated for its raw honesty and George's approach to thinking independently, something we'd come to see more from him as he delved into Eastern philosophy and spirituality. Critics looking back often mention how this track, alongside If I Needed Someone, paved the way for Harrison's development as a songwriter, one who'd moved beyond the Lennon-McCartney shadow. When Rubber Soul dropped, the world was just starting to understand who these guys in the band really were. They were artists on a journey, both musically and personally, challenging themselves and their audience to think deeper and live bolder. In late 1965, something big was brewing at Abbey Road Studios, and the Beatles were smack in the middle of it. Their song The Word, written by John Lennon and Paul McCartney, hit like a slow unfolding epiphany, capturing the idea that love could be something deeper, a kind of universal force, tapping into a cosmic sort of feeling that seemed to push the Beatles beyond their usual love ballads.
This song was all about stripping down love to its essence, but it was less about romantic love and more of a glimpse into a bigger idea. Lennon had started thinking of love as an underlying theme of the universe, something that connected everyone. He once said, "It's all about getting smart. It's the love and peace thing." And that's what makes The Word different. It's not just about boy meets girl. It's about something deeper, even spiritual. This was the Beatles speaking to a world that was ready to move past the everyday and dig into the meaning of existence. This track signaled the Beatles' awareness that people weren't just looking for catchy tunes. They wanted something more, a purpose, a reason to believe.
On November 10th, 1965, the Beatles laid down the song's foundation in just 3 takes. Paul brought a Motown-inspired bass line, while Ringo added a little flavor with his maracas. But George Martin's harmonium solo might be really what gave it a more of a psychedelic edge.
And then the harmonies added a powerful, almost gospel-like energy. When Rubber Soul was released, The Word didn't immediately pop as one of the Beatles' most iconic songs. Some critics felt the harmonies were a bit overdone, and compared to other songs on the album, it was seen as a little too straightforward. Yet, as the years went by, people began to see The Word for what it truly was. By the time All You Need Is Love came out in 1967, this track felt like an early preview of the Beatles' journey into songs that were less about hit singles and more about cultural shifts. We can look back now and see this song as sort of just the beginning of a theme the group would return to quite often. And to this day, it still remains one of those songs that speaks to the soul.
The Beatles recorded the rhythm track for Michelle in a single take at Abbey Road Studios on November 3rd, 1965. One of the standout tracks on the Beatles' album Rubber Soul, Michelle, holds a special place in the band's extensive catalog. The song's origins trace back to McCartney's earliest days as a musician, showcasing a blend of whimsical romance and innovative guitar work that would only continue to evolve and improve throughout the Beatles' time together in the 1960s. The roots of Michelle stretch back to around 1959. Paul McCartney composed the tune on his first guitar, a Zenith, which he still owns. This instrument was pivotal in his early songwriting journey, giving birth to several classic tracks. The song was also one of McCartney's initial forays into finger-picked guitar styles, drawing inspiration from Chet Atkins. Atkins' song Trombone, known for its simultaneous bass line and melody, served as a model for McCartney's composition.
The French element of Michelle was inspired by the bohemian atmosphere at parties hosted by Austin Mitchell, a tutor at the Liverpool College of Art. McCartney's attempts to seem sophisticated by pretending to speak French eventually found their way into the song. For the French lyrics, McCartney enlisted the help of Jan Vaughan, the wife of Ivan Vaughan, who had introduced McCartney to John Lennon in 1957. Jan, a French teacher, helped McCartney with phrases that fit the melody. John Lennon also played a crucial role in shaping the final version of Michelle. He contributed the song's middle section, drawing inspiration from Nina Simone's I Put a Spell on You.
Lennon's input added a bluesy edge to the otherwise straightforward ballad, balancing McCartney's lightness with a touch of melancholy. But Bob Dylan, known for his critical and discerning ear, had an interesting take on Michelle. In the mid-1960s, when Dylan was making the transition from folk to rock, he was deeply influenced by the Beatles' innovative approach to music. He admired their songwriting prowess, even if he sometimes teased or criticized specific aspects of their work. In March 1966, he said, "A song like Yesterday or Michelle, it's such a cop-out, man. If you go to the Library of Congress, you can find a lot better than that. There are millions of songs like Yesterday and Michelle written in Tin Pan Alley."
Despite this early criticism from Bob Dylan, the relationship between him and the Beatles got better as time went on. And for others, Michelle was a good example of the Beatles adding a touch of sophistication to the pop music world at the time. Rubber Soul holds a lot of treasures, and What Goes On is one of its more interesting entries. It's a bit of a time capsule, reaching back to some of John Lennon's earliest songwriting efforts, likely before he'd even met Paul. Originally set aside during sessions for From Me to You in 1963, the song made its way back in 1965 when the Beatles needed one last track to complete the album. And interestingly, it's one of the only Beatles songs credited to Lennon-McCartney-Starkey, since Ringo reportedly threw in a few words. As he put it in a 1966 interview, his contribution was about 5 words, and he's probably not wrong. Still, it's notable as one of Ringo's few co-writes with the band, and having him on lead vocals kept his American fan base happy.
It might not be one of the Beatles' big hits, but it's certainly got a charm of its own. The country flavor was something Ringo loved, and he'd lean into it even more in his solo career. In a way, the song captures a side of the Beatles that doesn't take itself too seriously. It's playful and a little offbeat.
And it might not be the most sophisticated Beatles song, but it's a solid snapshot of how the band worked. They wanted Ringo to have a moment, and they needed a fresh track, so instead of pulling something together hastily, they reached back and made a song that feels cohesive with the rest of the album. It's a quirky piece that plays to Ringo's strengths, keeps things lively, and gives Rubber Soul another layer of charm. It's a perfect example of why they're so beloved. Even on a last-minute addition, they went all in, made it fun, and left a bit of themselves in the details. This is one of the most intriguing songs on an album full of intriguing and delightful Beatles songs, Rubber Soul. And while at first glance it might seem like just another love song, if you dig deeper it becomes rather clear that Girl is much more than just another little romantic ditty. The song was created under the pressure of a tight deadline. The Beatles were in the middle of a marathon recording session at Abbey Road, scrambling to wrap up Rubber Soul before it went to press. Lennon led the charge on this one, playing acoustic guitar while Paul and George backed him up with harmony vocals and their own subtle instrumental touches. George Martin, their producer, kept the arrangement relatively simple, allowing Lennon's vocals and the haunting melody to take center stage. The recording is minimal but effective, with a rawness that fits the song's melancholy feel.
Lyrically, Lennon went to a place that felt more introspective and edgy than the typical Beatles fare of that era. Girl isn't about a flawless dream lover. Instead, she's a mysterious, almost dangerous figure, someone who draws the singer in while leaving him vulnerable and hurt. This theme of attraction mixed with caution was something Lennon explored throughout his career, and in later years, he'd say the song was subconsciously about his then-future partner, Yoko Ono.
One interesting part of the song is Lennon's use of breath in the chorus, a deep, almost seductive intake that he wanted to be as prominent as his singing. Producer George Martin applied a compressor to emphasize it, adding an extra layer of intimacy, and it's been said that the breath may have been a nod to the smoking culture that surrounded the Beatles at the time. Lennon, always the provocateur, was pushing boundaries with Girl, both in the sound and the words. And the backing vocals from Paul and George are also worth noting. The two harmonize on a repetitive tit-tit-tit during the bridge, something that was apparently a playful substitute for the Beach Boys-style la-la-la harmonies they initially considered. This little bit of mischief was typical of the Beatles' sense of humor and their quiet rebellion against mainstream norms. It wasn't just a song for the charts. It was also an inside joke, a way of slipping something subversive into their work.
Lennon would later say that Girl also reflected his complex relationship with religion. The line, "Was she told when she was young that pain would lead to pleasure?" was his critique of the idea that suffering is a necessary path to redemption. This kind of commentary was typical of Lennon, whose mix of cynicism and longing for truth gave his songs a bite that made the Beatles' music resonate on a different level.
For all its splendid layers, the song never made it as a single, though it probably could have. It's one of those songs that's become a sort of quiet classic that captures Lennon's wit, his questioning nature, and the band's growing sophistication. And in a way, it paved the path for Lennon's later songs, including Woman, which he described as a kind of sequel to Girl. This is a track from Rubber Soul that's always stood out to me, because it's raw, personal, and packed with emotion, and it shows a side of Paul we don't always get to see, frustrated, vulnerable, and even a little bit bitter. Paul has said that this song came from his rocky relationship with actress Jane Asher. They were engaged, but things weren't smooth sailing. She was dedicated to her acting career, while Paul wanted her to take on a more traditional role in his life. It was clear they were on different pages, and Paul admitted to feeling let down. "I was seeing through her facade," he said in an interview years later, and realizing that it wasn't quite all that it seemed. Ironically, Paul wrote this song in Asher's family home on Wimpole Street, as he did many other Beatles songs. Recording this song was also a bit rocky. There were a couple of different versions before the band landed on the final take we know today. The first attempt was on October 24th, 1965, after 9 hours in the studio. That version, which you can hear on Anthology 2, had a slower tempo and included hand clapping, classical guitar, a guitar solo, and bongos. It also lacked the middle 8 and ended with some vocal improvisation. The band wasn't feeling it, so they tried again on November 6th, but this time they went too fast. It wasn't until November 10th that they hit the sweet spot after 4 tries. With Paul on bass, John on acoustic guitar, and Ringo on the drums, of course. George added some tambourine and the guitar solo. Ringo even got a little experimental, adding a Hammond organ chord at the end of the verses and creating a percussion effect by tapping on a pack of matches. But by November 11th, the vocals were overdubbed, and Paul double-tracked his bass lines with John's backing. That session wrapped up at 7 a.m., marking the end of recording for Rubber Soul. Just 4 days later, on November 15th, the band rushed through the mono and stereo mixes to meet the pressing plant deadline. By December 3rd, the album hit the shelves, and the rest is history. In My Life is arguably the song that stands out the most on Rubber Soul. It's the Beatles at their creative peak, blending heartfelt nostalgia with musical innovation. Written primarily by John and enriched by Paul, the song's origins and production reflect the collaborative magic that defined their partnership. The genesis of the song stems from a suggestion by British journalist Kenneth Alsop, who asked Lennon why his music wasn't as introspective as his writing. This challenge inspired Lennon to craft lyrics that reflected on his past, initially as a literal journey through Liverpool landmarks. However, Lennon found the draft unconvincing, describing it as a boring bus trip song. Refocusing, he shifted to a broader contemplation of love, friendship, and memory, resulting in lyrics that were deeply personal yet universally resonant. Lennon later described this as his first real major piece of work, signaling a departure from the carefree tone of earlier Beatles tracks. While he credited McCartney with contributing the song's middle 8 melody, Lennon was adamant that the lyrics were entirely his. McCartney, for his part, recalled crafting the melody independently, drawing inspiration from Smokey Robinson's soulful style. A pivotal moment in the song's production came with the instrumental bridge. Initially undecided on its direction, producer George Martin proposed and recorded a Baroque-inspired piano solo. Since the piece was too intricate to perform at tempo, Martin played it at half speed and an octave lower. When the tape was sped up, the resulting harpsichord-like sound added a unique elegance to the song.
In My Life is often celebrated as one of the Beatles' greatest achievements. Its reflective lyrics and innovative production have resonated with generations, influencing countless artists. The song's inclusion in moments of cultural significance, such as Kurt Cobain's funeral, further cements its timeless appeal.
From its lyrical origins to its groundbreaking production, the song exemplifies the Beatles' ability to blend personal storytelling with artistic innovation. It's a masterpiece that continues to touch hearts and inspire minds. Wait, a lesser-known Beatles track holds a unique place in their catalog as a song that almost never saw the light of day. Written primarily by Paul McCartney, this track was originally intended for Help, but found new life during the Rubber Soul sessions. Despite its status as album filler, the song carries interesting production notes and historical context that give it a certain charm.
In the spring of 1965, the Beatles were in the Bahamas filming Help, their second feature film. It was during this time that Paul McCartney penned Wait, in the presence of actor Brandon DeWilde. DeWilde, a former child star, was fascinated by McCartney's songwriting process, and Paul later recalled writing much of the song in front of him. "He was a nice guy, fascinated by what we did. I seem to remember writing Wait in front of him, and him being interested to see it being written. The track's lyrics, reflective of McCartney's turbulent relationship with Jane Asher, are about the uncertainty of love when one partner is often away. The narrator pleads for his lover to wait for him, a sentiment likely shaped by McCartney's demanding career with the Beatles, a dynamic that strained his personal life.
The song was originally recorded on June 17, 1965, during the Help sessions, but wasn't included on the album in favor of the more energetic Dizzy Miss Lizzy as the album's closing number. The recording sat on the shelf until November of that year when the band, scrambling for a final track to complete Rubber Soul, revisited it. The Fab Four added new layers to the original take, including more guitar, maracas, and tambourine, bringing the track in line with their evolving 1965 sound.
John Lennon and Paul McCartney shared vocal duties on the song, with John's voice taking the lead for most of the track, except during the middle eight, where Paul's voice is more prominent. George Harrison added a guitar part using a volume pedal, a technique he had previously experimented with on songs like Yes It Is and I Need You. However, George seemed slightly uncomfortable with the pedal, leading to some technical hiccups. For instance, during a brief moment at 1:14, his guitar is cut off, and the volume control seems imprecise in parts of the track. One fascinating aspect of Wait is its sparse use of reverb. By late 1965, the Beatles were experimenting with a more intimate, dry sound influenced by the folk and acoustic styles of Bob Dylan. The band's producer, George Martin, and their sound engineer, Norman Smith, embraced this aesthetic shift, keeping Wait relatively free from the heavy reverb that had been common on their earlier records. This minimalistic approach can be heard throughout Rubber Soul, marking a departure from the band's earlier sonic palette.
Despite its hurried second life, Wait holds its own as a snapshot of the Beatles during their transitional period. It played a critical role in the completion of Rubber Soul. As the band scrambled to finish the album, the resurrection of this forgotten track allowed them to meet the deadline. And it bridges their earlier pop-centric work with the more introspective and experimental phase that would define their later years. While it may not be celebrated as a standout track, its journey from the cutting room floor to the final Rubber Soul track list showcases the Beatles' resourcefulness and the serendipity that often characterize their creative process. George Harrison's If I Needed Someone is a defining moment in the Beatles' 1965 catalog, embodying a rich blend of British pop, folk rock, and subtle Eastern influences. Written during the peak of Beatlemania, the song was heavily inspired by the burgeoning California folk rock scene, specifically the jangly guitar work of the Byrds. The influence is undeniable, with Harrison openly acknowledging that the track's guitar riff was based on The Bells of Rimney, a signature song by the Byrds.
The Beatles first encountered the Byrds during their August 1965 U.S. tour, a meeting that left an indelible mark on Harrison's songwriting. George was fascinated by the Byrds' use of the 12-string Rickenbacker guitar, an instrument the Beatles had popularized with their 1964 album A Hard Day's Night. Harrison, in turn, saw the Byrds' work as an evolution of the sound the Beatles had pioneered. The mutual admiration culminated in If I Needed Someone, a song that owes much to the Byrds' folk rock aesthetic, while also carving out new ground for Harrison's own musical identity. In the studio, the song was efficiently recorded in just 2 sessions at Abbey Road. The basic rhythm track was laid down on October 16, 1965, following a session for Day Tripper, one of the Beatles' most energetic singles. The band effortlessly captured the track in a single take, a testament to their cohesion at the time. 2 days later, the group added the essential overdubs, Harrison's lead vocals and trademark 12-string guitar work, as well as the rich vocal harmonies from John Lennon and Paul McCartney.
One of the most interesting aspects of If I Needed Someone is its simplicity. Built largely around the D chord, the song exemplifies Harrison's growing fascination with Indian music, particularly the use of drone and repetitive melodic patterns. While the song maintains a conventional rock structure, its minimalist chord progression foreshadows Harrison's later explorations into Eastern music, as heard in tracks like It's All Too Much and Blue Jay Way.
But despite its relatively straightforward composition, the song boasts several unique technical details. Harrison's use of a capo on the 7th fret of his 12-string Rickenbacker created a distinct, bright sound that became a hallmark of his playing. This technique, along with the tight harmonies and driving rhythm, lent the song a sophisticated yet accessible folk rock vibe that perfectly fit the Beatles' evolving sound on Rubber Soul. And perhaps the most significant legacy of If I Needed Someone is that it was the only song written by Harrison to feature in the Beatles' live setlist. It was performed during their final tour in 1966 and was part of their historic last concert at San Francisco's Candlestick Park. As such, it stands as a key marker in the evolution of Harrison's songwriting, bridging the gap between his early contributions to the band and his later solo achievements.
The song is from a moment in time when a fascinating intersection of British and American rock, folk, and the early stirrings of Harrison's Indian musical interests really started to form, making it a song that captures a moment of creative exchange and personal growth, showcasing the genius of George Harrison at a time when he was stepping out from the shadow of Lennon and McCartney.
The last track on Rubber Soul was the first to be recorded. In October 1965, the Beatles began their journey into the creation of Rubber Soul, which would go on to be hailed as a groundbreaking album. The first track recorded for this session was a song steeped in controversy and personal reflection. Though often dismissed by John Lennon as a throwaway, the track offers a fascinating glimpse into his psyche and the intricate creative process of the Beatles. The genesis of the song traces back to a lyric from Elvis Presley's 1955 hit Baby Let's Play House, itself a cover of Arthur Gunter's original blues tune. The line, "I'd rather see you dead, little girl, than to be with another man," resonated with Lennon, inspiring him to craft an entirely new narrative around it. However, while Presley's rendition was a playful assertion of desire, Lennon's interpretation darkened the sentiment, transforming it into a tale of jealousy and possessiveness. Over the years, Lennon openly criticized the song, labeling it one of his least favorite Beatles songs. In a 1970 interview with Rolling Stone, he reflected on its origins, admitting he just knocked it off and never considered it significant. By 1973, he described it as a song he always hated, though he acknowledged it was a favorite of George Harrison. This dislike perhaps stemmed from the song's raw honesty. Barry Miles, in his analysis, suggested that the lyrics were confessional, veiling Lennon's personal struggles in a third-person narrative. At the time, Lennon's marriage to Cynthia Powell was under strain, complicated by his infidelity and internal conflicts. In contrast, Paul McCartney's open relationship with Jane Asher provided a starkly different perspective, which may explain why he described the song as a macho piece reflective of Lennon's mindset.
The lyrics in the song certainly clash with the image of Lennon as a future advocate for peace and love. This stark juxtaposition has sparked ongoing debates about the artistic and personal significance of the song. On October 12, 1965, the Beatles entered Abbey Road Studios to record the track. Its distinctive rockabilly feel was initially enhanced by slapback echo on Lennon's vocals. Of note as well is George Harrison's intricate guitar work, including a doubled riff in the introduction and two solos, one of which employed a groundbreaking double-track technique. The session, lasting just over 4 hours, was efficient and polished, reflecting the Beatles' growing mastery in the studio. Despite Lennon's personal disdain for it, Run for Your Life remains an intriguing artifact of the Beatles' immense and profound catalog. The raw energy and controversial lyrics continue to evoke discussion amongst fans and scholars alike. And there you have it, Rubber Soul, song by song. This album is a prime example of how the Beatles were evolving, getting deeper with their lyrics and more adventurous with their sound. Every song has its own vibe, but together they create something that still hits hard today. Drop a comment with your favorite track, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you want more music breakdowns. Catch you in the next one.